Imagine you are tasked with investigating a truly complex system.
Right.
We're talking allegations of severe failures, corruption, institutional cover-ups, the big stuff.
Absolutely.
And you're handed this mandate, a set of rules, and a dedicated team. And you roll up your sleeves to dig in. But
You hit a wall.
you hit a massive
Yeah.
wall because you realize something incredibly frustrating. The very rules handed to you to conduct this investigation actually prevent you from looking at the most critical evidence.
Yeah. It's a structural trap.
Exactly. You are essentially being asked to find the truth while wearing a blindfold that the system itself just, tied around your eyes. And welcome to today's deep dive, where we are looking at exactly that kind of scenario.
It is, it's a genuinely fascinating paradox. And I think it's something that anyone interested in how large, powerful institutions are governed, well, you really need to understand this.
For sure. So today we're analyzing a highly detailed legal application. It concerns a tribunal of inquiry.
Specifically, we're looking at a tribunal governed by a piece of Irish legislation. It's known as Statutory Instrument Number 304 of 2024.
Which is a mouthful.
It is. So for the sake of sanity, we'll just call it SI 304.
Perfect. SI 304.
And this tribunal deals with the defense forces. The documents we are reviewing today relate to a specific application made under Section 1A of the Tribunals of Inquiry Act.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive, the whole point of this, is to unpack how legal architecture works.
The fine print.
Yes, the microscopic fine print. How highly specific definitions in structural drafting can accidentally create these internal tensions. Tensions that completely impair a tribunal's ability to, actually do its job.
It really is a masterclass in how that fine print dictates the outcome of an inquiry, long before the first witness even takes the stand.
But before we get into the weeds, we should clarify something.
Yeah, setting the tone here is crucial. The application we're walking through today, it does not challenge the independence, the integrity, or the conduct of the tribunal's sole member.
Or its legal team.
Exactly. We are not taking sides on any political or institutional disputes here. The sources make it incredibly clear that this isn't about bad faith on the part of the investigators.
It's purely about the structural architecture.
Right. We're looking at how the wording of a legal document interacts with messy, real-world complexities.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the best way to understand how this architecture works in practice is to look at the first major hurdle outlined in the application.
The gateway.
Yeah, I like to think of it as the bouncer at the door of a very exclusive nightclub. In SI 304, that bouncer is the definition of the word abuse.
Right.
If you want your complaint investigated by the tribunal, you have to get past this bouncer. So what exactly is this bouncer looking for?
Well, the gateway to getting an issue looked at is incredibly strict. According to the statute, abuse is explicitly defined. We're talking discrimination, bullying, harassment, physical torture, physical assault, psychological harm, sexual harassment, and any form of sexual misconduct.
Okay, let's play devil's advocate for a second here.
Go for it.
That sounds like a pretty comprehensive list. I mean, if a tribunal's looking into bad behavior, shouldn't they have a strict VIT list?
You would think so.
Because otherwise, wouldn't the bouncer just let everyone into the club, and the investigation becomes so massive that it goes on for a decade and achieves absolutely nothing?
And you are hitting on the exact tension that drafters face. You do need boundaries. You have to keep an inquiry focused. But the application points out how this specific boundary becomes a trap.
How so?
Well, on the 30th of June, 2025, the tribunal issued a ruling regarding how to interpret its terms of reference. The tribunal stated that this definition of abuse must be applied in a plain and literal manner.
Plain and literal.
Yes. They explicitly declined to expand that definition to include things like health and safety breaches or broader systemic failures.
Oh, wow. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because if the initiating complaint, the very first bad thing that happened to you, doesn't perfectly match one of those specific terms on the VIP list, it fails to pass the jurisdictional gateway.
It doesn't get in.
The bouncer says, sorry, you're not on the list, you can't come in, and your entire complaint is just tossed out.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you start to see the fundamental flaw in this architecture. Because in hierarchical structure...
Like a military organization.
Exactly, or a massive corporation or a government bureaucracy, systemic failures frequently don't manifest solely in that initial act. The application lays out this phenomenon beautifully. They call it the second-order complaint cascade.
The cascade. I think we all intuitively know this from watching any documentary about corporate scandals. The truly systemic rot is almost always in the cover-up, not just the initial crime.
Absolutely.
So where do these second-order complaints usually happen in the evidence we were looking at?
The documents detail complaints that are overwhelmingly process-centered rather than act-centered.
Meaning,
Meaning, we are talking about the deliberate mishandling of investigations, the suppression, alteration, or even outright destruction of investigation reports after they are filed.
that's terrifying.
Or perhaps there is a blatant refusal to act on the findings of a report that actually found wrongdoing. The sources also point to the weaponization of military justice processes against the person complaining.
They turn the system against you.
Right. And the misuse of medical boarding mechanisms to force people out.
Let me make sure I'm grasping the scale of this. Someone raises an issue, an investigation ostensibly happens, and then the report is just buried or altered by the chain of command.
Yes.
And the issue completely fails to be passed up to the commanding officers or the minister or the ombudsman.
That is the daily reality described in these filings. What's fascinating here is how the strict gateway creates a legal blind spot. Think back to our bouncer.
Right, the abuse list.
Let's say the very first thing that happened to you was a severe health and safety violation. Based on the June 30 ruling, a safety violation isn't abuse in a plain and literal sense.
So you don't get through the door.
You don't get through the door.
Wait, so because you didn't get through the door on day one, the entire subsequent chain of horrors, the suppressed reports, the retaliation from your superiors, the punitive medical evaluation,
All of it.
all that is completely excluded from scrutiny.
That is the cascade effect in action. The tribunal is mandated to investigate systemic failures and governance performance. But because the entry gateway is so narrow, the most probative, undeniable evidence of a broken system becomes legally inadmissible.
That's incredible.
It creates an absurd reality. The tribunal is tasked with evaluating how well the complaint system works, but it is structurally barred from looking at the exact instances where the complaint system was weaponized against the complainant.
It's like being asked to inspect a ship for leaks, but you're only allowed to look at the top deck.
Exactly.
And the hurdles don't stop at the front door. The legal filings highlight another massive roadblock. They call it the diagnostic hurdle.
Yes, the psychological harm issue.
Right. One of the acceptable forms of abuse on that VIP list is psychological harm. How does the tribunal's interpretation of that phrase complicate things?
Well, the tribunal adopted a definition of psychological harm that requires a recognized psychological injury identified in the DSM-5-TR.
The DSM.
Right. For those who might not be familiar, the DSM is the standard, highly clinical classification of mental disorders used by psychiatrists.
It's a diagnostic manual.
Exactly. So the tribunal introduced a clinical evidential threshold that isn't actually written explicitly in the wording of the terms of reference.
So unless my terrible boss literally gives me a condition that a psychiatrist can point to in a diagnostic textbook, the tribunal effectively says, sorry, sounds like a you problem.
Basically, yes.
Think about the real-world disconnect there. You could be working in an environment where you are subjected to a daily pattern of intimidation. You're isolated from your peers.
Your career stagnates.
Yes, because you're intentionally passed over for promotions for a decade. Your reputation is systematically destroyed by whispers and rumors. That can absolutely ruin your life and your family's stability.
It absolutely can, but it might not culminate in a formally diagnosed clinical injury that fits perfectly into the DSM-5-TR criteria.
Wow.
And because psychological harm is a gateway category, slapping this diagnostic threshold onto it severely narrows what the tribunal can even admit as evidence. It shrinks the entire evidential universe they have available to examine things like deterrence, retaliation, and systemic burden.
Which brings us to a massive definitional vacuum in the terms of reference regarding retaliation.
Yes.
The mandate actually requires the tribunal to investigate retaliation, reprisals, and intimidation. But the application points at a glaring issue with how those words are handled.
Those terms, retaliation, reprisal, and intimidation, are left totally undefined in SI 304.
Undefined.
Completely. And this raises an important question. What does retaliation actually look like in a rigid, hierarchical command structure?
Right. It's not going to be obvious.
It rarely looks like a physical assault in the hallway. It looks like non-promotion. It looks like the initiation of unfounded disciplinary charges that take months to resolve.
It's bureaucratic.
Exactly. It looks like investigative harassment or being quietly excluded from the training opportunities you need to advance your career.
But if abuse of authority or abuse of command isn't recognized as passing that strict abuse gateway we talked about earlier, then all those insidious forms of retaliation just aren't investigated.
They're ignored. The system effectively protects itself through paperwork.
It really highlights how critical the initial drafting of legal architecture is.
Absolutely. When a term is left undefined, it defaults to the overarching constraints of the document. If the document says everything must stem from abuse, and abuse is interpreted narrowly, then the investigation into retaliation is inherently crippled.
It's fascinating.
And this issue of narrow definitions limiting the scope of the inquiry shows up in a very literal geographic way as well.
Let's pivot to that. Because the chemical catch-22 is one of the most striking examples in the sources. The mandate deals with complaints regarding exposure to hazardous chemicals. But there's a geographic limit placed on this investigation.
There is. The terms of reference confine the investigation of hazardous chemicals strictly to the Air Corps headquarters at Casement Aerodrome.
Just that one location.
Just that one. However, the legal application demonstrates that the use of these hazardous chemicals and the severe exposure to them extended well beyond that single location. It happened in broader Defense Forces workshops across entirely different areas and bases.
Imagine being a mechanic working at a completely different base. You're handling the exact same toxic solvents, breathing the exact same fumes, and suffering the exact same health consequences as the folks at Casement Aerodrome.
Right.
But because the legal architecture drew a literal circle around one specific facility, your poisoning is legally invisible to the inquiry.
It is a devastating exclusion, and the sources point out an even deeper paradox here regarding what the personnel actually knew at the time of their exposure.
The knowledge paradox.
Yes, the affected personnel frequently had no idea that the substances they were handling were hazardous. The danger simply wasn't communicated to them by their superiors.
Hold on, are you saying they had to know they were being poisoned while they were being poisoned in order to complain about it later?
That's the issue.
If you don't know a chemical is slowly harming your nervous system, you obviously aren't going to file a grievance about it that day.
And this is exactly what the applicant is highlighting. If the tribunal's structural rules require individuals to have had knowledge of the hazard at the time of exposure for their experience to qualify as a valid complaint.
Then no one qualifies.
Exactly. Systemic exposure failures will entirely evade scrutiny. Think about the perverse incentive that creates.
The institution actually benefits from its own failure to inform its personnel.
Precisely. By keeping them in the dark, they immunize themselves from future inquiry.
So what does this all mean? When we take a step back from the specific definitions of abuse, the clinical thresholds of the DSM, the geographic limits on chemical exposure, what kind of picture does this paint of the overarching inquiry?
It paints a picture of an inquiry that is structurally forced to look at isolated procedures rather than holistic systems.
Procedures versus systems.
Right. The application makes a vital distinction here that is crucial for understanding institutional governance. Procedures are individual steps. Systems are institutional frameworks.
Okay.
A process is the full life cycle of a complaint. The terms of reference tell the tribunal to look at complaints processes. But if you interpret that narrowly, looking only at whether step A led to step B on a piece of paper, you completely miss the interconnected governance mechanisms.
You miss the invisible forces that actually dictate how things work in reality.
Oh.
A piece of paper might say a complaint was handled properly, while the reality is the complainant was terrified into silence behind closed doors.
Oh, yeah.
Speaking of governance mechanisms, the sources highlight a really fascinating tension regarding the ombudsman for the defense forces.
Yes. SI 304 requires the tribunal to have due regard for the independence of statutory office holders. And the ombudsman is a key part of the complaints architecture.
Right. They are meant to be an independent backstop, the ultimate safety net when the internal military chain of command fails a soldier.
But the application argues that this requirement to show due regard creates a massive blind spot.
Let's simplify this with an analogy. Imagine HR is supposed to protect you at your company, but they completely ignore your emails. Now imagine the outside investigators looking into the company's toxic culture aren't allowed to aggressively ask why HR ignored you.
Because they have to legally respect HR's independence.
Right. It's a total catch-22.
It is a profound limitation. If the tribunal is legally required to defer heavily to the independence of the ombudsman, they might not be able to examine how the escalation process to the ombudsman actually failed in practice.
Makes sense.
If you are too polite, legally speaking, to an independent office, you can't investigate whether that office was structurally bypassed, severely under-resourced, or just outright ignored by the military hierarchy.
The sources also mention a similar issue with how the tribunal is supposed to investigate the minister and the department.
They do. The mandate directs an investigation into the nature and performance of the statutory role of the minister. But the word nature is entirely undefined.
Which we know is dangerous now.
Very. The risk highlighted by the applicant is that the tribunal might treat the word nature descriptively rather than investigatively,
So they might just write a report saying, here is what the minister's role is on paper.
rather than here's how the minister's office structurally failed to perform oversight in reality. It's the difference between reading a job description and conducting a rigorous performance review.
We've talked a lot about the structural rules, but there's a deeply human element to all of this.
Sure really is.
If you are an individual who has been through this system, who has suffered retaliation, who wants to stand up and challenge these structural flaws, you face one final massive hurdle. Let's talk about the asymmetry of costs.
SI 304 contains a clause providing that costs incurred by reason of the failure of individuals to cooperate may be borne by those individuals.
Okay.
Furthermore, if an individual wants to challenge these narrow interpretations through judicial review in the courts, they face immense personal out-of-pocket cost exposure if they lose.
This is the part that really grounds this whole legal discussion for me. Imagine being a working-class family. You believe the system failed you, and you want to challenge the legal architecture in court.
Yeah.
If you lose, you can be on the hook for massive legal fees that could bankrupt you. Meanwhile, the institutional actors, the department, the military hierarchy, they are entirely publicly funded.
They have the bottomless pockets of the state to defend their interpretations of these rules.
This asymmetry creates a massive chilling effect. It discourages participation and deters anyone from mounting a structural challenge.
It is a classic David versus Goliath scenario, but Goliath gets to use the taxpayer's credit card while David has to risk his family's savings, his home, and his future.
It's a perfect storm. Every single phase, from the definition of the abuse to the clinical threshold of the harm, to the geography of the exposure, to the financial risk of speaking up, it all compounds.
It stacks up to create an almost impenetrable wall. And the application summarizes this brilliantly through what they call the mandate impairment matrix.
The mandate impairment matrix.
Yes, it is a concept that links each structural feature we've discussed to its operational consequence and ultimately to its cumulative impairment of the tribunal's mandate.
Right.
The abuse gateway leads to evidence exclusion, the psychological harm threshold leads to narrow intake, the retaliation gap leads to under-investigation.
And that cumulative impairment is exactly why this application was made under Section 1A of the Tribunals of Inquiry Acts. We mentioned Section 1A at the very beginning, but what does that actually allow the applicant to do? They aren't just complaining into the void, right?
Not at all. Section 1A is a specific statutory mechanism that allows a tribunal to essentially pause and say to the government, the terms of reference you gave us are structurally flawed. They require alteration.
So they can actually fix it.
The applicant is formally asking the tribunal to refer these structural issues back to the houses of the Oireachtas, the legislature, so they can potentially amend the rules, widen the gateways, and fix the architecture before the inquiry goes any further.
It is a profound legal maneuver. It is an acknowledgement that sometimes an investigation isn't limited by a lack of evidence or a lack of brave witnesses or even a lack of political will.
Right.
Sometimes it is limited by the very definitions and legal frameworks that were supposedly designed to guide it. The architecture itself becomes the obstacle.
And that is the core takeaway for you as a listener today. When we evaluate the effectiveness of any oversight body, any public inquiry, or any major investigation, we have to look past the grand public statements of intent.
We have to scrutinize the structural architecture.
We have to ask who defined the terms, what was quietly left out of the fine print, and ultimately who benefits from those omissions.
It's a lot to process, but it fundamentally changes how you view accountability. It makes you realize that the battle for the truth is often won or lost in the initial drafting of the legal mandate, long before the public ever hears a single word of testimony.
Absolutely.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to ponder long after this deep dive ends. Think about the complex institutions in your own life, your workplace, your local government, or even the healthcare system.
Yeah.
When a massive, powerful system is allowed to write the dictionary that defines its own failures, how can we ever expect it to accurately diagnose its own deep-rooted flaws?
A question that is as relevant to our daily lives as it is to this tribunal.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another stack of sources to unpack.